Okay, Clara, you probably won't be able to see much because I'm gonna be sitting at the table and we're gonna be talking about reading, so, for you to just the audio part's probably gonna be helpful. All right. Okay, come over here.
Can she hear us?
Yeah, this room, that is a microphone right there that hears everybody. So, I don't think that this is called a Zoom room. I think the only fully equipped Zoom room is in Linden over there, where the OL students usually meet. But this one is kind of second best. All right. Great Commission. Okay. There's a lot packed into this first section. I'm sure you noticed that. There's a ton of history here. So let's hear your thinking on the reading. Ella, did you have the book yet?
I have the book. I didn't bring it with me. I forgot to.
Okay, but did you bring some?
No, I forgot to write down notes. I'm sorry. I
Okay.
got the reading done, but I forgot to write down.
Okay, all right. If you can, I don't know if you remember anything from it, you can still contribute to the. Yeah, all right. If you can get comments to me, I'll still.
Oh, sure.
I want to make sure you. Okay. So what are some impressions from this reading? There's a ton here to talk about. And I did ask you to read the preface also. Erwin Lutzer, just to give you a little background, the foreword was written by Erwin Lutzer, and he was probably one of the most well-known pastors of the Moody Church in Chicago. Pretty solid guy, pretty conservative in his theology, and so that one of the reasons I wanted you to read that part is because, did I say the preface forward or I just say introduction? I can't remember what I said on there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess it's called it's called forward. There's a preface and forward and introduction. Okay. But that's part of the reason I wanted you to, because Erwin Lutzer is very well known historically as a pastor in Chicago. So, who will give us this good comment here?
In the forward, I think he said that God's hand guides history, and then he talks about the Israelites. And I think that's good to keep in mind that God is still under control. I feel like with everything we wonder how things happen, or if we can share the gospel with the whole world, but God is still under control, and he guides history and how things happen, and so we don't have to worry about even how our world is today, how we can share God's word or whatever, because it's still in God's hand all through the history.
Mm-hmm.
It was what God did, and not necessarily what he used people, and he uses everyone, even people who sin, because everyone does. So yeah, I think that's good to keep in mind if go through history, that it's all in God's hand and he guided it.
Yeah. Miriam, that's a really good point. If we did not believe in the sovereignty of God in the church age, we would probably all conclude that the whole church thing is a massive failure. 2,000 years. What verse would you go to in the Bible to defend the idea that the church is not a massive failure, but it's actually accomplishing the purpose set out for it? You think of a reference, I'm thinking of something that Jesus said.
Jesus said, I will build my church, and the gates of hell.
Yeah. So just keep in mind that if you believe that the church has been a failure for 2,000 years, then that reflects on the master builder. If you're a contractor on a construction site and the site fails, guess who gets the blame? The contractor. So I have, over the last, especially decade or so of my life, I have kind of changed the way I view what's happening in missionary work in the church around the world. I've really come to more of a conclusion that even though it often looks to us like it's a failure, God is getting his work done. Jesus is accomplishing what he set out to do. And that ought to encourage us. That's a really good comment. Okay, what else?
What were we supposed to read? So it was like the introduction to like chapter all.
Through chapter 1.
Okay, so I did do the right.
Yep. Yep.
It's on page 2.
Okay.
Some guy named, I can't even say his last name, but David Bimington.
Uh-huh.
I've never heard of this, but he gave like 4 qualities of what evangelism and religion should be.
Yep.
I just wrote them down, but I've never like heard of it before. I thought it was super interesting. It's like, I'll just read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
What did I say? Conservation, the belief that lives need to be changed, activism, the expression of the gospel and effort, biblicalism, a particular regard for the Bible and what may be called, I don't even know what the last word I say.
Crucicentrism.
Yeah. A stress on the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. I've never like heard of those things. Or, like I've heard of like those ideas, but, like the way they put it in those like qualities of like it should be like the focus in mission.
Mhm.
I was like, I thought it was very interesting how they worded it.
That's good. Yeah, conversionism is simply the idea that there have to be transformed lives. You know, the gospel changes lives. And then the second one, biblicism, you know, obviously Bible has to be central in what we preach and teach. Oh, I missed activism, sorry. Activism means that this conversion is not going to happen by itself. You may remember the famous quote from William Carey's interview with pastors, and they said, one of the guys said, you know, when God is ready to convert the heathen, he'll do it without you or me. And activism says, no, God has chosen to use us. We're a necessary component. Yeah, biblicism, Bible-centered, and then crucicentrism is really almost a subset of biblicism. We believe that in the scriptures, the crucified Christ is the key. The sacrifice is the key. Good, yeah. What else?
I had a question.
Yeah.
It said like Jim Elliot, like I know like he missioned like his like mission fields in India. It said he created praying towns. Like what is that? Like, 'cause I know in India you can't,
That's
like,
John Elliott.
or John.
Yeah, it's
oh,
easy.
yeah.
That's okay. Jim Elliott's in Ecuador in the 1950s. Yeah. One way to remember them is that Jim Elliott has 2 L's. He's the second one. And John Elliott has 1 L. He's the first one. Eliot. Yeah, sorry, what was your question about that?
It said he founded a series of praying towns. I know like in India you can't like openly like share your faith that you can, but it's like they're all like they have like 80 million gods. You like try to talk to them.
Okay, no, he's not talking about,
Oh, I'm thinking Native American and upside down.
Yeah.
That makes more sense now.
and we're going to talk about him next week, Lord willing, John Elliott. I know that nowadays, I'll just tell you this up front, nowadays here, it's considered incorrect to refer to Native Americans as Indians. Why is that? Kind of getting a little ahead, but since you brought his name up.
Just because the Indians in India?
Exactly. In other words, the name Indian was a misnomer. The explorers thought they had arrived in the the West Indies. And so they named them Indians incorrectly. And it's gotten to be a big deal. I mean, even like the Cleveland Indian baseball team had to change its name, you know, all that stuff. So, yeah, but John Elliott was working out in the Northeast. Yeah. But we'll talk about that more in detail next week. Yeah. You'll hear me use the word Indian just because I grew up with it, you know, and so it's hard for me to remember to say, oh, Native Americans. Yeah. Good. What else?
Introduction was as long as chapter 1.
You sense the author struggling to try to condense everything he's got to say.
And you should just make this chapter 1.
Yeah, you know, actually, as I was reading this, I wondered if I was going to hear any feedback on that. You're right. It's nice. It's a little over 8 pages. For future reference, I would encourage you as you're reading to mark it. Mine's full of marked and I've circled some words and stuff. If you do that, then when we have the discussion, you can have a whole bunch of stuff there at your fingertips that you can bring up. Maybe some of you did that.
I did, but there was one thing in the introduction I was hoping to talk about, but I forgot to mark it. I marked all the other ones, and then I was like trying to look for it.
Do you have an idea what it was about?
No.
Okay.
There was one of the things I had on page 13 of chapter 1.
Mhm.
It talked about that foreign mission activity was like lacking among all the Protestants, I don't know.
Protestants.
Is.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it just like makes a random comment that the missionaries, the Anabaptists, really ventured out of the confines of their own like groups, and they never tried to convert the Jews in Europe or the Turks just beyond the borders, which is kind of interesting.
Okay, let's take a few moments and define some of these groups, okay? Because there are several groups mentioned in here. And if we don't understand something of the distinction between them, it's going to really cloud our understanding. You guys, how many of you have not yet studied Western Civ? You haven't, Ella? You're the only one? Rest of you, are you in it now or is it, have you done it? Okay. So, you know, when you're studying Western civilization, some of these group names come up. So, okay, we've already mentioned that the Catholic Church got a head start on everybody, right? They had the money, they had the politics, they had all the connections. Something else that they had was access to borders and the seaports and things like that so that they could easily send their missionaries around the world. Most of the countries that were part of the Protestant Reformation were landlocked countries. You look at Germany is landlocked in that sense, okay? Italy is not, but, you know, Italy was, you know, again, is the center of Catholicism. France, I mean, some of them have limited access to seas, but most of them are pretty landlocked. That made it difficult for them to even think about. Can you remember something else in the reading here that he mentioned that made it hard for some of these Protestant Reformation countries to take the gospel beyond? One of them was the geographic issue of being landlocked. But do you remember something else in the reading that was mentioned?
It talked about like that they didn't have people who spoke the language.
Mm-hmm.
They could like really spread the gospel and like tell them because they just couldn't speak the language.
Mm-hmm. Okay, language was a big barrier. And among the Protestants, some of them believed that only the highly educated and clergy were actually qualified to evangelize. The poor people in the churches didn't have enough education. They were afraid of heresy being developed by people that didn't really know the Bible well. And so some of those Protestants said only the clergy, the educated, can really, you know, go to bat with the Catholics and others to preach the gospel. Now, do you remember? Do you happen to remember there was another word that he used several times in here to refer to a segment of the Protestants? So here you have Catholics and Protestants, but within the Protestant Reformation, there was a particular group that emphasized this. You know, only the clergy can really be the evangelizers and the teachers. And they also believed that church and state should cooperate. You remember what the name, he used a term there that you may not have heard before, but it appears several times. It's the word magistrates, okay? I don't remember where he begins talking about that. But when
Is
you
that
read it,
the term for the whole group of people, or is that the term for the leaders?
well, okay, that's a good question. The answer is actually both in a sense. There were three groups that he identified that were part of the magisteria, if you will, in the Protestant Reformation. And they were the Lutherans, okay, the Calvinists under John Calvin, and the Anglicans. Okay, remember the Anglicans are a group that broke from England under Henry VIII. They were founded because he wanted to get divorced. The Pope said no, and he said, go fly a kite. And he started the Anglican Church. So the Anglican Church isn't really that Protestant. It was kind of Catholicism with a little bit different clothing. Okay, but those three groups were referred to as the magisterium, as being singular. And the reason for that term is because magistrate was a word that was often used of political leaders, okay, governors, other politicians in a given location. And so they held these two ideas. One is that only the educated can really evangelize, which knocks out most of the church. And then also they believed that they should be able to cooperate with the politics, with the state, in order to advance the gospel, because their idea was to win the entire country, and you couldn't do that without reaching the politics, the elite. So when you hear the word magisterium or magistrate in relation to missions, that's what I'm talking about. But what are the three groups again? Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, right? Okay, so we have two problems with getting evangelism done, missions done in Europe: landlocked, and then you mentioned specifically that they need to be educated. I can't remember what
I
you.
said language.
Oh, sorry, yeah, and only the educated would be bilingual, right? Now there's let me see. Okay. Yeah, all right, good. Okay, let's move on. What other comments do you have?
Are the Anabaptists like Protestant? Or are they something
Okay,
completely different?
Good, excellent. That's another term we need to know. Okay, Anabaptists. Does anybody have remember any read? I don't want to steal anybody's thunder. What was it? What's an Anabaptist?
Baptized again, right?
Right,
That's what the term technically means.
right. So the first time would have been what? They had to be baptized again. What would the first baptism have been?
As a Catholic, I think. As a
Infant
Muslims,
baptism?
yeah, we're baptized as a
Right.
baby.
Right. And so, yeah, and actually, my understanding of history is that they did not give themselves that name. That was a derogatory term given because they didn't consider it rebaptism.
Mhm.
They considered it the only legitimate baptism, right? But their enemies named it rebaptism. They've already been baptized once, now they're doing it again. So it was really a derogatory term. But the Anabaptists then would be a segment of Protestants. Now, okay, we don't have time to get into this, and I'm not sure how far we would go anyway, but there are some who believe that Anabaptists were never really part of the Catholic Church in the first place, so they should not be called Protestants. Remember that the word Protestant refers to people who had been part of the Catholic Church. They protested against their church, and some of them tried to stay in the Catholic Church to reform it, and they became known as reformers, right? And others completely left. Okay, but there are some who will argue that the Anabaptists were never part of the Catholic Church in the first place, so they would be actually a separate group from the Catholics and the Protestants. Now, this is history, it's old history, but when you drive down the street and you see, a Lutheran church or, a Presbyterian church or so, it's good to have some historical background of who they were. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you can expand on this or if we don't have time for it, but you said that Protestant, sometimes people use it in the wrong way. And don't we sometimes use the word Protestant, especially like in missions to differ between like Christian, oh, you might be Catholic. We say Protestant. But if, like, personally, I was never part of the Catholic Church, or maybe this institution wasn't part of the Catholic Church. So is it wrong for us to sometimes call ourselves Protestant?
Okay, that's a really good question. This may sound really strange to you guys, but I can remember my mom and dad, when they were applying for certain things, there would be a question on the application, Catholic or Protestant. I mean, they wouldn't even, atheists wasn't even on there, or some other, evangelical. You pretty much as an American, you identified yourself as either Catholic or Protestant. And so it was an overgeneralization, Sharon, because you're right. Protestants are groups that actually came out of the Catholic Church. And there are lots of evangelical groups that were never part of it. And that's part of the argument with the Anabaptists. Many think that they go back to ancient groups like the Waldenses, and now that you can, talk about other groups that would defend the idea that they were never part of it.
So a more accurate term would be evangelical.
Yeah.
Now.
Yep. I mean, even Protestants would fall under that umbrella. So, the United Methodist Church would consider itself an evangelical church. Okay. For that matter, even some of the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses call themselves evangelicals. So, I prefer not to refer to myself as a Protestant because I kind of take the view that the Baptists were exceptional to that. I'm sure that there were Baptists who came out of the Catholic Church, but did the Baptists as a movement start during the time of the Protestant Reformation? And many would argue no. Okay. Now, the Anabaptists, Laurel, does that make sense? So they're kind of a questionable. Were they a subset of Protestants or a completely separate group? Dr. Ken Rathbun would be a good one to ask that question, teaching his doctorates in history. What was it again? Oh, one of the problems, do you remember reading, even though the Anabaptists wanted to be missional, they wanted to be missionaries, do you remember there was something said there about what they limited their missions to? They didn't go beyond, it actually relates, Miriam, to your comment. Your comment was that
Good question.
the Anabaptists claimed to be missions-minded, but they would not go beyond their own, anybody that spoke their language. So it wasn't just, the larger Protestant group, but they didn't. Now, why didn't they? Because most Anabaptists, were not highly educated and did not learn other languages, but they limited themselves to people who spoke their own language. If some of those people living back then could fast forward to the 21st century, they would probably be amazed at what's happening now in terms of language and culture and studies and things that we do to prepare people to take the gospel everywhere. A lot of that was just not a thing back then.
I had that section marked in here. We're talking about the Anabaptists and stuff, and it does say specifically here that they would go to people anywhere that spoke their language to spread their faith. And it says it is hardly a world-embracing mission. But it keeps going and talks about how the Anabaptist missionaries worked exclusively to convert Catholics or magisterial Protestants to their particular vision of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So, which I don't think is necessarily bad if they have a good vision or like they feel like the other people aren't actually Christians. But I don't know. That kind of seems like almost like a fight, I guess, amongst all of them. Instead of let's reach out and share the gospel to more people, well, I'm going to convert you to my side and make you see my views and things.
Yeah, they're going after professing Christendom is what they're doing. They're going after Catholics. And there's other, when missionaries go to Latin America or, even Western Europe, they're going to be, not so much, but primarily they're going after Catholics. Okay, that's an overstatement, but it's especially true in Latin America. Tons. So people have criticized missionaries actually for going to Latin America. They're already Christianized. Why are you trying to? So, yeah.
Do you think the Catholics in this time period a lot of them were actually genuine Christians, or do you think a lot of the rules and works had worked itself into this Catholic group by this time?
By the time of the Reformation, if you're
this is Reformation.
yeah, see, this book is not beginning with Paul. It's starting starting a little later on. Part of that is probably because there's so little information available, as we said before, those early years. So by the time you get to this, the Protestant Reformation, the Anabaptist groups, all that, the Catholic Church is pretty pretty much set in stone. Yep. I mean, is it possible there are people in the church that were saved? Yeah, absolutely. I'd be foolish to say that there could not ever be a Christian, true born again Christian. But if they really understood the teaching of the church, they would certainly, you'd think they'd see the need to get out of it. Sorry, somebody throwing so many terms at you.
Doesn't really relate to the discussion, but like, didn't like the early 2000s, like the Anabaptists did something like bad or like something happened?
When? In the early
Like
what?
the early 2000s, like, remember like certain churches like took Baptist out of their name because they want to be associated with Anabaptists?
Not so much with Anabaptists, but with some radical forms of Baptist churches here in the U.S. For instance, the one in Westboro. Yeah. So there were people in that region, even in that state. It's Kansas or Missouri? I keep forgetting. Help me out. Isn't it Kansas, Westboro Baptist? It's either Kansas, Missouri. So there were groups that said, if we maintain the name Baptist, people are going to think of Westboro. That's one that made all the headlines. So let's change our name. And I don't have a problem with that personally because those labels are not biblically induced. They're for convenience. The Anabaptists did take a lot of flack.
I think it was the Westboro. I think I got a mix up when you said that.
Yeah.
Clicked.
Yeah, because I don't think that there's any church today that calls itself Anabaptist.
Yeah.
Who knows? There may be, but as a movement, that was hundreds of years ago.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you think that people saw that as like not good, or I don't know, that they didn't reach like other countries or like people with a different language, and that they just like stayed in their country? Like, was that people thought that was not good what they did, or is it just like, I don't know?
Everybody kind of just accepted it.
Yeah, because when I read through it, it kind of felt like he like argued for it that it was okay what they did, and people like didn't see it as good. I don't know. Do you think like people thought they should have done that? Or?
This is an opinion, Miriam. I think that in general, people didn't really think too far beyond that because so much of what happened was circumstantial. We mentioned the borders, we mentioned the language issue, and there's actually a third factor that made missionary work really difficult for these people. Do you remember what it was? Especially in the Reformation countries, Germany, France, Switzerland. They were fighting wars against the Catholics and others. And they were so occupied just in fighting those wars that they didn't have time and resources to take the gospel farther. At least they didn't think they did. Yeah.
I mean, more like today. Like probably that time they were like not really thinking about it. Like more today, if people, I don't know.
I think today, in general, evangelicals recognize that there was a lack, and it wasn't an excusable one. In fact, on one of these pages, just a second, I can dig it up really quick. He mentions that Spain actually they were involved in wars also, and yet they still managed to do evangelistic work, missionary work.
Page 14.
14.
It says, well, it can be argued that the Spanish Empire is, somewhere there says involvement in the multiple wars did not stop the Spanish missionaries.
Right. Yeah, top of 14. The Spanish were involved in the Dutch Revolt, the Armada campaign against England, the Lepanto campaign with Venice, and the papacy against the Turks, the 30 Years' War, etc. Yet they also engaged in missions work in the New World in Asia. So I think the point that he's trying to make is it's just not quite that simple. Well, we're busy fighting war, so we can't do missionary work. I mean, think about believers in Germany or the United States during World War II. Did they just say, well, I guess we're in a war, so we have to wait? They didn't. So I think that in general, people today understand that that was not a legitimate excuse. Yeah.
The teaching random comment I had on one of the pages. It's just like page 19, and maybe I read it wrong or didn't understand it, but at the top it says that The reformers also addressed family life, teaching that the household, the fundamental unit of society, was a mini church, that the father was acting as a pastor for the family.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I just kind of thought that was weird because I don't think that should be viewed that way. I don't know, like if they're looking at it as if like it's the family's representing Christ and the bride of the church, that's fine, but it almost sounds like they're saying more like, I don't know, giving the father more of a pastor role than he should have.
Yeah, it kind of depends on how they're using the word pastor. I mean, there is a sense in which a father in the home is a shepherd to his family. I shepherd my wife and my children. I kind of think I think what they're really trying to say is they emphasize the importance of the home in the discipleship process. I don't think that they would have, probably some did, but as a general rule, I don't think they viewed all of these families as house churches. To that extreme. I think it's more the principle that the father is responsible to extend the ministry of the church in his home.
Because I've met some people who kind of have this view, and they like start churches in their house and they don't think it's necessary to go to church because
Right.
they.
See, and I don't think the reformers would have done that simply because they viewed the importance of, the main church, the magisteria and all of that. And so I just don't think that would have been, but you're right, there are people today that are, really behind the house church movement. I think that's different than this. Anything else come to mind? This is our first day to do this, so we're just kind of getting the idea, but it's what we want to do. I know you don't have your book with you, Ella, but do you remember anything specifically that we haven't talked about?
Nothing that I've really talked about. I thought it was interesting, kind of like Miriam said, how you brought up the Israelites and all that right away in the beginning, and just how all that goes together. And
He made the statement that the Anabaptists, even they, did not go after the Jewish people. There was a very, very strong anti-Semitic feeling among the Protestants and even among some of the Anabaptists, which is one of the things I do want to point out here related to that is that, I don't know if you remember reading that their eschatology played an important role in their view of missions. The Anabaptists were millenarians. They believed in a millennium. And the majority of the Protestants did not. Okay, they were amillennial. They didn't believe in a literal millennial kingdom. And he's not the only author that has said this. Several authors have made this comment that those who believe in a literal, millennial kingdom coming up in the future tend to have a bigger zeal for missionary work. Why would that be? What difference would that make in your view of missions?
You repeat the question.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep. Most of the Protestants believed, they were amillennialists. They believed that we're doing the work of church until Jesus comes back. He's going to come back. He's going to make a general judgment, and we're on into eternity. No rapture, no tribulation, no millennial kingdom. But those who believe in that, such as we, have tended over the centuries to have a stronger missional zeal. What is it about our view of eschatology and the literal kingdom coming and all that seems to fuel missionary zeal?
I think because we know that our purpose as the church is to share the gospel and to spread it to all nations, and knowing that Christ is going to rapture us. Like, I don't know, once we fulfill that purpose, I guess. Because we know that we have a specific purpose. Not saying people of other beliefs don't have a specific purpose, but we have that in mind, that we are just here for this designated amount of time, and that there's a lot more to come with this kingdom and everything.
Okay. All right, good. Sharon?
When I think about the tribulation, I'm not scared for myself because I know I won't be here. But I know that those people around me, even good people, they're not saved. They're gonna have to go through the tribulation. So
Okay,
it really motivates you to share the gospel with people around you.
good.
And even knowing that, like, we don't want people to have to go through all of God's wrath, but God also doesn't want them to go through his wrath. Like, he wants to save them, but we know that he has to judge sinners ultimately.
Okay.
And I think it just fuels, because God gave us a love from himself, that we have that love to give to other people and share the gospel.
Good. Now, in fairness, the reformers believed in the wrath of God and all that in eternity, and God are separated from God. But there's something about the unfolding of the story. We talked about this last year in Theology of Missions. You weren't in that class, right? You two were in there. We talked about this, and there's something about seeing the conclusion, seeing how things unfold and wrap up, the consummation, we call it, that naturally inspires you, with the urgency of being faithful to the Lord in these days. Whereas if you just kind of have a general idea, concept of someday God's going to come back and it's all going to be over, there's a lack of definition there that tends to relax people more when it comes to taking the gospel. It may be a subjective thing, but I think it does make a difference. And that has been a characteristic of people who believe in mission. Just really quick in closing, one thing I do want to say is that he says it here too. We should not conclude that Protestants didn't do any missionary work and the Anabaptists and the others did it all. That is not true. John Calvin sent people to Brazil and other places in the world. So to say that it's that black and white is an oversimplification. It's just not fair. So, all right, well, there was a ton there. But next time, so bring your books, have them marked up and stuff, bring your questions. And
Are we gonna be doing this like every Friday?
this is our Friday.
Okay.
Yep, it's a new thing this year, but I really think it's helpful to get this bigger picture. Thank you, guys. Enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. What is Friday? It's nice. Sharon, did you do anything for your birthday?